So I'm super happy to have you here with us today, and I'm going to get to ask the first questions, and then we'll obviously open up questions to you guys. The first thing I want to talk about is you, rather than what you think, about angel investing and starting companies in general. And I want to start at the really beginning of your career when you decided to go into banking, and more specifically at Lehman Brothers in '06. History proved you right in your choice of bank. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit, because most VCs or most investors, when they transition into venture, decide to look back, in a bad way at their banking days, if they had any. And I was wondering if you could share any valuable lessons that you had from then.
So first of all, thank you for having me, to the family, to Vlad, and to you. So banking, Lehman Brothers, the biggest bankruptcy in history. It was a big lesson for me because everyone told me when I took this job, it was not only, they're going to pay you a lot, it's very safe, and you're going to have a prosperous career. And in 2008, that quickly didn't happen and unhappened very fast. And the two biggest learnings I take from it, and the reason I don't have any shame around it, number one, I was very young and had very little to do with the ultimate bankruptcy, but I think there's a lot to be learned in how we look at risk. And a lot of people think startups are incredibly risky, like, oh my God, you're doing something from scratch with no resources, and they are incredibly risky, but risk can take many forms. And while I was there, even up until the very end, everyone was like, oh, it's too big to fail, and it turned out it wasn't. And so I think that really pushed me into the startup landscape, because I said, well, if I'm going to be at a big company and always be an employee, and that is also going to be risky, I might as well go start my own thing. And so that led me to go start a company in New York City. Back then, the New York City ecosystem was definitely still developing. There was nothing like the family, nothing like this going on a regular basis. But I jumped in and started working on a company and meeting other founders, and that's what ultimately led me to venture. I had no plans of moving into investing. I really wanted to go build a company. The other thing about Lehman Brothers that I think it taught me that is a lesson that we're living right now is that the market has a psychology. The market is made up of people, and so it, like people, has flaws and blind spots and biases. And it's important to remember that, especially as you go out and you raise money. You're going to be told no a lot, and you'll question whether or not, is it you, is it the market? And it's important to know that a market is just a big group of people. And, as we see IPOs coming out to market right now and questions around profitability and valuations, and as seed funds grow up and become more mature, I actually think right now it's really interesting to think about, what is the psychology for early stage tech, and how does that change your plan in raising money?
So we'll definitely get back to that a bit later, sort of progressing back on your career. After banking, you decided to build your own company. I'm guessing that given Lehman had blown up, you thought that starting your own thing wasn't too risky anymore. And you decided to build a payment solution for SMBs, and I was wondering if you could just go in a bit into why you decided to start that. I'm sure that we have a couple of prospective founders here in the room, and they'd probably be interested in hearing what your thought process was for starting that company.
Yeah, so my family growing up ran a retail jewelry store, and I realized that my parents always struggled to adopt technology because they were running a single location, literally mom and pop jewelry store, and didn't have time to think about how tech fit into their life. And as in Paris, I'm sure every jewelry store takes, and most people pay with credit card. And if you think about what a credit card transaction is, it should be sort of like the first entry into a CRM. And back then, that was sort of a novel concept of building your customer base through credit card transactions. And every business pays a big portion of the revenue to credit card companies for basically a commodity service. And so I wanted to take that data and auto-generate a CRM for retail locations of all kinds, not just jewelry stores, and then use that data to help them market. So it kind of hit this close to home aspect where I'd grown up seeing this problem, and actually had also seen inside Lehman Brothers that most of the businesses built around credit card networks were not using data in really intelligent ways. They were building their business around fee income. And so part of what we did while I was at Lehman Brothers was package up credit card debt and sell it to the market. That was also how securitization even got its start as an industry, and still to this day is probably the better part of securitization. And so I said, wow, this is interesting. These companies are sitting on an incredible trove of data. They, are competing with each other on fee income, not on product. Is there a way to build this product? And I quickly realized that it was harder than I realized, but also anything in payments requires being on the inside and being a network. Product is sort of tertiary, I would say, to having the right connections and then thinking about how you're going to partner with people in that ecosystem because it's so tightly held. And after about a year, I got an offer to join my partner Jeff at what was then Atlas, now Accomplice. And so I decided to move up to Boston and take that opportunity.
Do you think anything has changed since 2009, 2010, when you were building Social Swipe, that would make building that product easier now? So like distribution costs for that sort of solution has definitely gone down. SMBs are becoming more prone to use those sort of types of SaaS tools. Do you think you'd do anything differently now?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson for me was I was thinking about it, here's this product for people who are SMBs and who have credit cards. The biggest insight from that same moment in time, I'd say famously came from Jack and all the other entrepreneurs who realized that all these businesses are going to be carrying around these little supercomputers that will become the point of sale, and then building marketing software becomes a part of that solution. And when I was in New York, I wasn't thinking about mobile in the right way, and I think when I look back, if I'm critical of what I missed, it's that I think founders should look for enabling technologies and then build products around those instead of just trying to run to a solution and then bringing technology in behind it, especially in a market like that, because point of sale becomes your channel for selling. And so even Womply, who built sort of the closest product that I was thinking of, the mobile impact is what really enables what they're doing. And so when I think back to 2009, I wasn't thinking about mobile kind of from a value point of view. I was thinking about it, I have this device, and then payments is separate from that. And the biggest companies kind of merged those two findings.
Did you end up investing in a company that was what you considered to be a better version of the company you'd built?
Womply would have been it. I met Toby when I moved to San Francisco in 2014, and we were friends socially, and he's built an incredible company. And actually Pascal, a French angel investor, it's one of his better angel investments, but at that point they were kind of too far along, and yeah, I didn't make an investment. At Atlas, we did make a few payments investments that have done pretty well. Probably the most notable is a company called Plastic. My partner Ryan led that investment. But yeah, since then I haven't really done any payment deals. So I got interested in other areas, and payments it's a really difficult place. Outside of Stripe and Plastic and a couple breakouts, it's a really hard place to build a business.
And so looking back at those operational years, is there anything that you still, because it was a while ago, but I'm sure that some of the lessons are still relevant. Is there a couple of things that you still use when looking at deals now or when talking to founders, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, I think being a founder, frankly, just taught me humility. Anyone who is able to start a business of any size from zero and make it a reality deserves incredible kudos. It's really challenging. Someone told me it takes just a huge amount of life force, and I think that that isn't even really a phrase in English, but if there's a translation into French, it's worth knowing. But it just requires an incredible force of nature to get something from 0 to 1, as they say. So I respect anyone who does that. I hope I never bring any arrogance to a meeting or to an interaction where, because I'm investing, people think that I know more or have done more. The special people in our ecosystem are all founders, and it's because they're able to start companies, and my failure as a founder, I think, informed that, that humility and thinking around how special that is.
I saw you mention a couple times that you thought that capital was sort of crappy differentiator. And so when you're looking, or when you're working with founders and you're looking at potential investors for their companies, what are the things that you encourage them to look for? And if those things have anything to do with operational experience, how do you make sure that the experience that they do have isn't outdated or hasn't become irrelevant now?
Yeah, I think the reason capital is a crappy differentiator is also an investor meets with you, hopefully they invest, that money goes in the door, and then the real work starts. And so I think the first thing to look for is just fit, as far as interpersonal fit and making sure you get along. I think all investors and founders have stories of feeling the need to take someone's money and it not being a fit and regretting that down the road because they can just create a big headache. And so the first thing I'd say is fit. The second thing, which I appreciate that the family espouses so aggressively, is just how they pay it forward. The best thing an investor can do is probably make introductions to other investors and then help you with fundraising. And if you don't get the sense that they can connect you with other investors or give you good advice around fundraising, I don't really know where else they're going to add value. Obviously, if they can make introductions to help you recruit talent, that's always nice, although it's really difficult. And so, yeah, I think just be realistic about it. If they can't help introducing you to other investors or fundraising, you're probably not going to get much from them. And then if you don't trust them, I'm not sure I would take their money.
Yeah, it's always better not to take money from people you don't trust. So taking a step back at the transition from operator to VC, can you walk us through a couple of the deals that you did at Atlas/Accomplice, the ones you're most happy about, the ones that turned out weirdest?
Yeah. I mean, the most successful deal I worked on at Atlas/Accomplice is obviously PillPack. We sold that to Amazon last year for $1 billion. And we'll probably start to see it play a bigger role in Amazon's pharmacy offering later this year, which is really exciting to see. That was, funny enough, a good lesson in better lucky than good. I ended up doing a presentation not dissimilar from this at Techstars in Boston about AngelList, where I had been working at the time, and bumped into TJ in the lobby. And we just struck up a relationship because he also grew up in retail, pharmacy, not jewelry, but we kind of bonded over that fact and immediately got along. And when he told me more about what they were doing, it was really obvious that this was a big opportunity. In the United States, our pharmacy system is fairly broken and definitely not customer-centric. And the mix of product and design that they were bringing, but also his context on sort of the problem of pharmacy was just really, really interesting. And we moved really quickly. Fred and I did the deal together, and luckily got to it before demo day and got the deal done. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. I think another lesson in my investing that has come back, so I invested in this company, DataCamp, with my partner, Chris. And it was outside my focus, but I met this guy, Jonathan, the founder, who's Belgian, actually, and was just immediately struck by his tenacity and love for data science. And what DataCamp works on is really interesting and needed as far as skill set in the world, honestly. But Jonathan moved to the United States. I met him in San Francisco, and they've just, I think, proven how important it is to execute and execute well. They're in a very busy market around education, and they're verticalized. So in theory, their addressable market isn't even quite as big as something like lynda.com or other businesses like that. But they just raised a huge round and ran the business profitably for several years, really incredible what they've built. What are some of the other companies? Creative Market, an online marketplace. I've invested in that company twice. We first sold it to Autodesk and then spun it out, and I led their Series A. They're doing really, really well and have kind of gotten through the difficult phase of building a marketplace. And on the West Coast, probably my most famous company is a company called Patreon. They help influencers and video creators and really creators of all kind build communities that support their work. And Jack and the team there have done an incredible job. I would say building community and turning that into a product and scaling that.
And with all these companies where you invested, you're usually the first money in or one of the first, at least, institutional investors in. How did the relationship evolve? So like, I think it's sometimes a bit unclear for early stage founders what they can expect from their seed or their Series A investors as they go forward. So if you could just like walk us through what your relationship with the team at PillPack was, for instance, that'd be cool.
Yeah. PillPack was unique in that a lot of the work to be done there was regulatory. It's an incredible business, but the other piece that Amazon got was these licenses in all 50 states. And so a big challenge in that particular instance was creating a product culture in a highly regulated industry. And so I honestly think one of the things the investors did really well there is they were just patient, because that created a situation where it was very hard to be like this overnight success in an unregulated industry, and they still moved incredibly quickly. And I think also that meant that PillPack needed to raise a lot of money, and so really TJ did a great job, but everyone who invested in that company helped them raise larger rounds and get the capital they needed to succeed. I think in most cases, I try and live by my own advice. I build a relationship with the founder to be trusted, and 80% of my value comes through fundraising. And so making introductions to other investors and then helping them refine their story and get ready, to pitch later stage investors, and understanding, what they want to hear, how they want to hear it, and what the process is. Fundraising, unfortunately, there's no real way to learn it other than doing it, and at each round, it's a different skill set. Seed is very different than Series A, is very different than Series B. And so having someone who's in the market and sees that all the time to help guide you is really valuable. And that's probably when I spend the most time with founders, is in the moment, in the months leading up to them going to market and then getting the investment closed.
And do you only do that for the round that follows yours, or is it pretty much until the end?
Pretty much until the end. Investors kind of all stick together, and so a big part of my job is building, relationships with, if I'm an angel investor, with seed investors, Series A investors, and later than that, just because it's not a huge universe, and one or two introductions can go really far. And so, yeah, I know people all the way to crossover investing, and I build relationships with them for my companies. My companies now won't be there for another 2 or 3 years, but when they're there, those relationships will be open and ready.
One thing that you mentioned in passing when talking about PillPack was how difficult it was to create a product culture in a highly regulated environment. One thing that we're seeing more and more in Europe is how hard it is to create a culture full stop in distributed teams. So an increasing amount of our founders are looking to build distributed teams to sort of go beyond the challenge of recruiting locally. In some places like London, Paris and Berlin, to some extent, it's okay to recruit locally. It's not too much of a bottleneck. When you leave those sort of big hubs, it becomes quite difficult. Yeah. And so a lot are sort of looking for models that they can replicate, or at least tips for what it's like to both hire and maintain a good culture, a good remote culture, distributed culture. And I was wondering if you had any examples of your portfolio companies or founders that you've worked with who did that successfully.
Yeah, I think building a distributed culture is becoming more and more common in Silicon Valley. The old saying there was like, there's enough people here, you should be able to build a team locally, but the cost of living is preventing that now. I think the two biggest lessons from my portfolio are don't go halfway. So if you're going to be distributed, be fully distributed. Don't have an HQ office with half the people in it and then half distributed. That seems to create a bunch of challenges, and you don't get the benefits of either. I would say the second thing is don't go into building a distributed culture and thinking like, it's all positives. There are negatives that you need to be really intentional about solving for. Obviously, one of them is bringing people together with some frequency. And so whatever that is, monthly, quarterly, really put a lot of effort and time and energy into creating those events and those moments together, because that kind of is the culture when you're distributed. And a lot of the teams that I invest in, they move where they get people together, both to kind of like change things up, but also so that it's not, okay, we're always getting together in Paris or San Francisco, and that becomes kind of the de facto hub. Yeah, so I would say those are the two biggest things to watch out for, is make sure you're actually fully distributed and practicing that, and then you're getting together regularly and being very intentional about what you do together so you can actually build culture.
I want to go back to you a bit. One thing that's quite particular about your journey is that you were both an angel investor, well actually both, I don't know how you say it, an angel investor, a VC, and also sort of heading a scout program, essentially. And I was wondering if you could walk us through what you see as the upsides and downsides of those three options, both as an investor, and as an LP. Sorry, as an entrepreneur, as an investor, and as an LP.
So what are the pros and cons of each of those roles?
Yeah. And which one do you preferred, and
interesting.
why you're choosing to do what you're doing?
Yeah.
Let's start with the LPs.
Yeah, I would say being an LP is my least favorite, although they're very important and play a really critical role. Being an LP is probably the most challenging because you have all the same expectations around generating returns, and you have the least amount of control because you're 2 steps removed. You're investing in another investor who then invests in a founder. I'm very lucky to have had that experience, though, because I think most investors go through their careers learning from their partners and their own experience. I got to learn from my partners, my own experience, and then the experience of 155 other angel investors. And so it taught me what I was doing right and what I was doing wrong. I would say my second out of the 3 favorite was being a lead investor at Seed and Series A at Accomplice. That was an amazing place to work and a privilege to do that work. I think the challenge there is, for me, when you're inside a partnership, sort of by nature, what you're doing is trying to create consensus. And it's kind of ironic because in our business, most of the biggest returns and outcomes are generated by companies that in the beginning no one liked. And so how do you solve that? And I would say I've always brought a more entrepreneurial bend to my investing, and so that's sort of how I landed in angel investing, because angel investors by nature are very entrepreneurial. They don't have a partnership and a bunch of resources. You kind of have to go out, meet founders, sell yourself into those investments, and then continually add value so you're relevant to those companies. And so I felt kind of most at home being a free agent and just getting out there and doing it. And so that's sort of what drove my transition to being a full-time angel investor.
So one of the most notable things that you did was start Maiden Lane at AngelList, or with AngelList, I don't exactly know what the way you describe it, which then evolved into Spearheads. And I was wondering if you could just explain a bit how that changed your relationship with founders, increasing that, adding that level of abstraction, and what you look for when you're building these angel networks or scout programs, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah, so quickly, Maiden Lane was the first institutional fund built on top of AngelList. It started really as my partner Jeff's idea. We partnered with Naval, and we thought LPs should have money on AngelList. And outside of that, we kind of went in with an open mind and did the best we could, and I think built a really great portfolio and worked with some incredible people. The thing that it taught me, first of all, was our portfolio was very broad, and in many cases, we didn't meet the team before we invested. And a lot of people would tell you, oh, that must mean you made worse decisions, or the companies weren't as high quality. And so far the evidence is completely to the contrary. So I think it was another lesson in humility, where when we're investing so early, it's really difficult to see into the future. So keep an open mind and really just solve for working with the best teams. I was saying earlier, the other big lesson when you look at the companies who've been breakout successes inside Maiden Lane, and I think this is a lesson that should be shared more often globally, the market right now is paying a huge premium for founders who can execute. And several of our biggest companies are in spaces where there's tons of competitors. They have great products, to be sure, and they're great product teams, but what really makes them stand out is their speed of execution. And I think more and more, especially angel investors, are getting wind of this aspect of what makes companies successful. And even if they don't love a space, but they see a team that's executing really well, that's worth a lot to them. And I think as founders, especially founders ahead of starting a company, it's the number one thing, the number one standard you can hold yourself to is working on a problem and with people that will allow you to execute more quickly. And hanging out in spaces or with groups like the family, every decision you make is how can we move forward more quickly. And I would have never seen that just being, an investor who led seed and Series A rounds. It took working with a bigger group of people and seeing a broader portfolio and basically disagreeing with some of the investments that we made and then being proven wrong over time. Probably the biggest example, we're invested in this company called Grove Collaborative. They don't operate in France yet, but it's an e-commerce company. They're selling stuff that's all available on Amazon. It was one of the most contentious investments that we made, but this really famous angel investor brought it to us, Eric Blackford, who is an incredible founder in the travel space, and he said, Stu, the founder, is really special, just invest. And so we ended up doing it. The company is doing incredibly well, and they're selling stuff, again, that Amazon sells, so in theory they're direct competition with Amazon, and it just hasn't mattered. Stu and the team there have executed so incredibly well that it's opened the market's eyes to this new business, kind of like, basically like building Trader Joe's online. They have a lot of their own proprietary goods, and then they sell other people's goods when they don't have something in that market. And for me, it's just been a huge reality check. I used to say, oh, we never invest in e-commerce. It's just not our specialty. We don't like those businesses. And my takeaway from it, and even as I left Accomplice and started my own thing, is just, be mission-driven and execute incredibly quickly. That itself is such a powerful differentiator. And I don't think it's talked about or celebrated enough in the market.
So what do you think scout programs should be, how do you think scout programs should be designed to have the scouts who can find these founders who are able to execute? What do you think is the ideal scout program design?
The ideal scout program is one that just says we're backing interesting people, and the scout should have a good view on that, either through a relationship they had previously or having advised that company or whatever. I think that's what makes scout programs so powerful, is they're not held to sort of the same standard, especially around, okay, this is a good investment for X and Y. It should just be like, this is a great founder. I know that. We're putting in money. Don't overthink it. And that's definitely played out in the stuff I've seen at Maiden Lane. And then my friends who were some of the earliest scouts with Sequoia back in 2009 and 10, same deal there. They said, we didn't know what this person was going to build exactly. Maybe we didn't even like it, but we knew that that was a great founder and that they'd execute. And we put money in, and that's been worthwhile.
So are you concentrated in the number of scouts that you have? Do you have a lot of scouts? Are you looking for people who are sort of like early on and very much at the edge of what's going on, or are you looking for people with more experience in a bigger network? How do you think about those parameters?
Yeah, so Spearhead, which was sort of what Maiden Lane morphed into and acts as a really progressive and thoughtful scout program. There we were targeting founders who didn't have any liquidity, but we thought had really interesting networks and insights into other really interesting founders. And so the idea there was take $250K, we'll teach you how to think about investing, but basically invest in the best people you know. I got really excited about working with people who wanted to go full time, so who were not founding companies and who want to focus on a thematic area. And so all the people that I work with are going to have $1 million allocations and be focused in a really particular area, whether it's verticalized SaaS or something with machine learning, or maybe something around offline transactions or voice transactions, whatever it is. There's a very clear mandate that they look at, and the idea is, and stealing this from the best people that we saw in Maiden Lane, a really good angel investor is basically a community builder, and so building a theme is what basically identifies your community, and the idea is build a community and then invest in the best people. And I think that strategy works well for people that want to be full-time and become investors longer term, because it gives you a playbook to execute against and helps you wake up every day with something to do. The biggest challenge in investing is kind of, you get blinded by the ocean because there's so much opportunity, and like, how do you separate good from bad when things are that early? And how do you make decisions and over time improve that decision-making process? And so having a theme to invest in kind of gives you that structure.
And so your pitch to these potential scouts is like, I'm essentially solving your first-time fund issue because you're going to be able to build a portfolio, but I take care of the LP relationship and all the back office, essentially.
Yeah, we create a service out of investing so that people can get started more quickly, and more importantly, focus all their efforts on building that community instead of doing a little bit of fundraising, a little bit of co-investor relationship building, a little bit of sourcing and investing. We give them that structure, and then also we build a community around it ourselves, so you're not investing alone. One of the biggest challenges, and part of the reason I think it's so difficult in getting good at investing, is everyone's learning through trial and error, and that just takes a really, really long time. And even if you're investing alongside someone who's not investing in what you are, you all still have to go through the process of sourcing a founder, making a decision to invest, negotiating the investment, and then adding value. All that is very universal, whether you're in Paris, San Francisco, whether you're seed, angel, or Series A. And there's a lot of learning that needs to happen so you can, climb the curve more quickly. And right now, there's really no place to do that, which is crazy.
Yeah, and you're not just learning by trial and error, you're also earning by trial and error. And I was wondering how you think about sort of like cross-carry and those things when you're building scout programs, because the people don't essentially work on any of the same deals necessarily, but you still want to make them feel part of a program or at least a community. And is that something that you had put in place at all at Spearhead? Is that something that you're thinking of putting in place later on?
Yeah, Spearhead is kind of single player. You have your economics and on you go. And I think that's great because what makes Spearhead so unique is you can take money from Spearhead, other VCs, other angel investors or LPs, whoever you want, and that's a great thing. With what I'm building, the idea is you take 2/3 of the carry, and then 1/3 is sort of shared in a pool. And what that means is you have an incentive to share investments that are not fit for you, but are fit for your friend. And that if your friend ends up investing in Uber or some crazy outlier, the entire community benefits. And frankly, that we're taking that economic structure just from Sequoia Scout. That's how they structured their program. But it's early days. I think these carry structures will evolve over time. But I think having a little bit of like performance, meaning your own carry, and then carry as a community is a good thing, because at this stage, being collaborative is really, really important.
One last question from me before we open up to everyone else. You mentioned at one point that there was a big premium that was being paid on founders' the ability to execute, but I've also heard you say a couple of times that you put a lot of emphasis on product, and I was wondering what in particular you were looking for in product-driven teams, and if there were any examples of companies that stood out really early on in their ability to build great product.
Yeah. So originally I was going to speak for 40 minutes about why do a startup at all. I don't think it's something we talk about collectively enough as a community. The number of startups is actually going down, at least in the United States, but I'm sure that's a global trend. It's never been harder to compete, and it's definitely a story in the media, at least, like, why build a social networking company when Facebook's just going to rip you off? Like, there's a lot of negativity around just getting something started. And I think when I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and talking with founder friends who think about it as well, I think there's 3 reasons to do a startup. The first is if you can't work under a boss, it's kind of your only option. So that's a big part of it. And less it being negative about not having a boss and more about kind of, Vlad actually used this phrase, like emancipating yourself, finding freedom. I think that's a great reason to take the risk in starting a company. I think the second reason is because startups always start small. And I think time and time again, we see that small teams are actually way more effective. And so if you want to work with a small, highly leveraged team that can do a lot with very little, a startup is a great way to do that. And then I think the third reason is there has to be something that just either annoys you or inspires you so much that you kind of want to take the chaotic mess that exists in that market now and order it and build a product around it. And if you go through the process of thinking really deeply about those three things and answering, okay, why am I doing this company? Why take this on, this huge challenge, this all-encompassing challenge? I think that answer is basically your pitch. And more than your pitch, it ends up also being what you do every day when you wake up. And as you wake up, you have to execute on those things and execute as quickly as humanly possible. And I actually am sort of revising how I look at companies now. I really look at the team. I make sure the market's not obviously small and uninteresting, but outside of that, all I look at is how quickly they're moving through the challenges of getting started. There's a company I just committed to right before I got on the plane to Paris, and it's a team, they're very young, they just came out of college, they have so many things, so many challenges to face, but we've been talking about 8 weeks now, and they went through finals, they just finished and graduated college, and they've accomplished more in those 8 weeks than some of my companies have accomplished in 6 months. And I sat down with them and I'm like, guys, I don't know what to say. Like, this may work, it may not, but if you keep executing this quickly, like, I will die before I stop helping you. Like, let's just keep moving at this pace. I'm convinced if we do, like, we'll build a very, very big company. And when I look at the Maiden Lane portfolio and my broader portfolio and all the work I've done over the last decade, the reason you need to think about why you're starting a company is because you have to move so fast. And if that answer is very clear, I think it becomes clear why you're the right person to build that company, why you're building the right product, and ultimately you'll execute more quickly. And the market, as far as I can tell, as I help other companies raise money, that's what other investors are also looking for and immediately investing in. Everyone realizes that a lot of the markets, aren't obvious. Uber famously started, in the black car market and isn't even in that market as much anymore. That's impossible to predict, but, you can even look at them, how quickly they executed and made them a unique, for better and for worse, company in every regard. And so I think we're going to see over the next 4 or 5 years, especially as some of the high-flying companies fall, that speed of execution is really everything. And so anything you can do to think more clearly about what you're working on and move faster, like, do that. Go in that direction.
Great, thanks a lot. Before we open up to questions, please join me in thanking Dustin. We have a flying queue for questions.
Yeah, you catch it?
Hi Dustin, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question here. I'm building an IoT solution, and this IoT solution is I'm giving the hardware for free for the customer, and I'm only generating data because I work in industrial plants. That's the only way to do it.
Okay.
And then whenever I'm talking with the investors or others, they are always skeptical about, you are an IoT solution, we don't want to back up hardware or something like that, and for me it's a challenge. So how can I go over it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think we've seen in the last few years a big change. A lot of investors were fine not having much clarity on business model, which I think is at the core of your question. Are you giving away the hardware or not? How does that play into how you price things and how you sell to businesses? And I think now what people have realized, the whole adage used to be, give it away for free so we can grow faster, get bigger, and then have this bigger outcome. And I think what's happened in the last few years is people have realized that business model is part of product. In fact, it's almost like the second product that you build. First, solve the problem, and then charge them. And it's no longer optional to think about them separately, and I think it's no longer optional to think about that down the road. Even in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, where people are very generous with how they look at business models, immediately now people are saying, okay, what is your business model? And more importantly, how does this factor into your relationship with the customer? And so, I think a lot of investors might be pushing back on that and saying, there's a lot of evidence that businesses will pay for the hardware. That's not ultimately their big question. Their big question is who owns the data, how do they use it, and then what value does that bring both to you as the seller and to them as the customer. And answering that early on is really important. We're invested in a company that helps workers in warehouses. They wear this device, and if they make a movement that could hurt their back or their body in any way, it buzzes at them. The hardware is very straightforward, but it's like the data is the most important piece. And there was this debate around, so do we make money on the hardware or not? And they ended up basically selling the hardware at break even and then charging kind of the subscription revenue. And I think a lot of times you see companies taking that approach where the subscription piece is associated with the data, and that kind of structures the relationship and gives you more attractive revenue than selling hardware piece by piece.
Thanks, Dustin. I was wondering how important is product market fit when you investing in early startups?
It's a great question. So I invest before product, before traction, and often before other investors. So product market fit's not even possible for me. But when I was at Accomplice, it was very, very important. Product market fit, I think it gets talked about and it makes people think it's this binary state, like you have it or you don't. The reality is it's always kind of in a gray area and evolving. I can say in today's market to raise like a really good seed round, the more evidence of product market fit you have, the better. And a lot of times what this means, it's sort of counterintuitive, but I find a lot of founders in the search of product market fit, they try and go after more customers, more types of customers, and a broader range. And my advice to my companies is actually don't do that. Go fewer customers, narrower, but much deeper. And the main reason is I think the smartest people in the market look at as engagement as a better indicator of product market fit. So let's say you had two options. You could have 5 customers, with like a little bit less revenue, but you have 5 versus 2 with more revenue per customer. I think a lot of investors prefer deeper relationships with 2 customers and a view on how you're going to grow that relationship with those customers as evidence of product market fit instead of I have 5 going on to 6, but it's kind of small, not even just revenue, but it's like a small use case for them. And I can't emphasize that enough. In the early days when you're finding product market fit, you don't have enough resources to cover very many use cases or customer types. So pick 1 or 2 of each and go very deep and tell a better story around that. Investors are actually really good at opening their imagination, being like, I see how we could take this success and apply it elsewhere, but they're not very good at saying, well, you've applied it to 5, but it doesn't really matter to any of them. There's no evidence for them to chew on, and so it breaks down quickly.
All right, thanks. I have 2 questions. First, what is the best book to read for somebody who wants to master the VC industry and to execute quickly? One for the skills and another for the mindset. And what is the best way to reaching you?
You can definitely reach me on Twitter. It's just my last name. I don't know if there is a great book that you haven't heard of. 0 to 1 is one a lot of people talk about. I think a lot of people talk about executing quickly. I'm not sure it's something you can read. And the reason is it's very personal to you. I think all of us, as we move through society, are taught sort of not to take risk and not to do things quickly. And so how you undo that training is very personal. And I think that's my one bit of advice is if you don't have a good answer for why you are starting this company, or if you're investing, why you are making this investment, then it's going to be really difficult to move quickly. And so a part of it is just, I think, however you want to develop self-awareness and understand what your strengths and weaknesses are and really making sure you're aligned with your strengths, that's the most critical piece. And the reason there probably isn't an amazing book about that is because it's very personal. So however you want to find self-awareness through some practice, through reading or whatever, that would be my biggest recommendation. And it comes through as an investor, I can say, it comes through in the pitch really, really quickly in a way that you can't describe, but you feel almost immediately. And with that company I was talking about earlier, it was just clear that they're also working on a problem that is a good fit for them and their skill sets. And while the future is very unknown, like their tie into that is obvious. And that comes through in the advisors that they've been able to bring to the investments, how quickly they just go ask, they were running from the meeting with me to go talk to customers. And they're like, we already have 5 customer meetings lined up. And I was like, wow, they're on the other coast and it already just, however they got to these customers, got to them and started meeting with them. It's just, there was like gravity pulling them. And that's what I think you have to keep your eyes open for, is where is gravity pulling you, what problem, and why you. But yeah, I haven't run across a great book, is the short answer.
Hi, Dustin. Yes, just one question regarding, you emphasize a lot the thing that we have to move fast and things like this. I'm currently working in a fintech, and we have faced 2 kind of things. One is the short-term things, short-term things to do, and also the long-term. What would you recommend us to focus on regarding our day-to-day things to do? For instance, do we have to work on the way we create the community or whatever, which would be more the short-term thing, or on the long-term things would be like the new features that we would like to input in our chatbot or whatever. So what would you recommend us to focus on? And also, what would you recommend us to emphasize when we speak to investors? What is our priority and things like this?
It's a great question. So on the first part, I would say, especially in fintech, it's one of the areas where it's a very good idea to be talking to a specialist investor, so someone who's done lots of fintech, because fintech companies, especially for the first 2 years, they move at a different pace than other companies. And so those investors are pretty known. Sheil at 500 Startups is a good friend of mine and someone that I send all my fintech stuff to, because his network and knowledge about solving those problems are just so much better than mine. And if I'm going to invest, I will be investing with him just because he's so much better than me at it. And so, yeah, that would be the first thing, is map out the entire universe of fintech investors. And even a year ahead of even needing to know them, start to try and build the relationship. On the customer side, I think the best tactic I've seen inside the fintech startups I've worked with has been they build an audience very early on. So even before product, these topics, or this topic, money, is universal, and it's a part of all of our lives constantly. And so it's a very nice area where you can build a conversation even if you don't have a product. And so a lot of the people that I've met with, they have email lists of 5, 10, 20,000 people long, and they even on those lists know who they want to bring in as their first beta customers the second something is ready. And I think that goes a long way, because it shows the investor that you can think about growth ahead of even being able to generate it. And so by the time the product's ready, you will have a very good channel or distribution method for getting to those customers. Outside of that, just be patient. There's no great answer to that, unfortunately.
Hey, Dustin. Question is, when building an MVP and already running out of funds, what do you recommend the approach is to actually look for funds? Because, well, when you approach an investor like yourself, you expect a prototype. But what if funds are already dried out before that stage?
I don't expect a prototype at all. I think that's very investor specific. So that's part of it. Like, talk to investors who don't expect a prototype, who are comfortable going that early. I've learned over the last year that there are very few investors like that, and they're hard to identify. That would be my first piece. The second piece is, there is no one good answer. I think giving yourself enough personal runway to get from A to B is is probably the best answer. Just don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to run out of money before an MVP. And you know, that's kind of crappy because it's basically like you just need the privilege to have enough money to do that. Unfortunately, there's enough teams who just, that's table stakes, that they just show up with that. It's kind of, I think the market's been trained that, you know, a lot of people do expect it. So yeah, live on savings, have a side hustle, drive Uber, whatever you have to do, you know. I mean, look, I'm an investor. A lot of people think I'm rich. I'm not. I'm lucky enough to own my apartment, and so for the last year, I've been Airbnb-ing my apartment and sleeping on couches to fund my salary. So if an investor can do it, I mean, you know, you should definitely be able to do it too.
Thank you.
Any other questions? One last question.
Hi. As a founder, what should you look for in a good angel investor?
Yeah, I mean, I think fit, just personal fit, is by far and above number one. You know, I think investors are treated as special. They're just people. And as you get to know them, if it just feels right, do more of that. If not, don't work with them. I think the second is referencing. Most investors really live and die by the networks that they build. Most of the best investments that I see come through referral. And so, you know, who introduces you to that investor and what they say about that person, I would listen to that. I think looking at their track record and then double checking, like, oh, when did you invest in that company? And hearing more about their thought process and other investments is another good way to kind of gauge whether or not it's a fit. And then the other thing is that I think going into every meeting knowing that, you know, it's probably going to be a no, right? So how can you get value out of that meeting assuming it's a no? What questions would you like that person to answer? And it requires a decent amount of legwork, but doing that preparation to know, okay, they invested in X or Y company, a good question that I don't think is asked enough, because you're already there, you're doing the meeting. What made you invest in X or Y? Like, what got you to that decision? Was it product? Was it team? How did you think about it? What kind of traction did they have? A lot of times I think people assume it's a one-way street. Like, you're there to pitch, the investor sits quietly and that's it. Most investors have pretty big egos, and so create a two-way discussion, be complimentary, like fluff them up a little bit, but also get some data from them. That, to me, none of that stuff is confidential. You know, if you want to say, I mean, any investment I've ever made, if you guys want to ask directly what made you, I can tell you. I remember to the minute, you know, the first time I met all the companies and what got me excited about it. And I don't think I've ever been asked that question. And it's not proprietary. I'm happy to share that. The other thing is, look at investor meetings maybe to like make you less nervous. Look at it as you're building a panel of sort of what the market wants to see, what the market thinks about, where you're building product. You know, to your question around the hardware, software thing. Investors have sort of an opinion that's an N of one, meaning it's just their opinion. I don't go out and ask, what's your opinion on all the companies I invest in? But you are getting that from several people. And that can be a very, very valuable data set in helping you define your strategy for fundraising. And a lot of times I think people are just like in a sales mindset where like, I'm going to sell this person. If it's a failure, they just move it aside. But you should take other things away from that meeting, internalize them, and adjust your strategy accordingly. And what you'll end up having is, let's say you meet with 50 investors. You're like, okay, I don't think investors really understand our market that well. Okay, so how would that affect your pitch? How would that affect even your introduction to that investor, right? And so making those adjustments over time can really help you go into each meeting more prepared and exactly understanding like what you're going to get out of it, even if it's not money.
Was that the last question?
Hi. You spoke about distributed teams. Did you see companies fail or face crisis because they were distributed and not managing it?
Yeah, I would say it happens all the time. I think a lot of us collectively are excited about distributed teams because it solves partly an economic issue and then partly a time issue. Especially, at least in Silicon Valley, or I would say generally on the West Coast, maybe just in the United States generally, we're trying to commute less, right? If you're commuting an hour twice a day, it really, really sucks. Commuting, remote teams help solve that issue. And then the cost of living question, we're always struggling with because we, as startups, don't have a ton of resources. On the flip side of that, it creates a huge management challenge for the founders. If I haven't beat it to death, I'll continue to say it. We have to execute quickly at this stage. And so I think that's the biggest challenge with distributed teams is like making sure that you set it up in a way that allows you to continue to execute quickly and really thinking intentionally about what that means. And when there is a crisis, I would just say no two crises are the same, but try and get person to person, either virtually or in person, as fast as possible to figure it out. And and remember that the virtual ways of communicating kind of bring these challenges that I think eventually build crisis, right? Which is to say, oh, we're not communicating well. They don't know what sort of the objectives are, the strategy is, and so can't map against that. I just finished reading this book called Extreme Ownership. I would say it's just okay. It's a lot of very obvious stuff. If you want like the point of it, it's basically that in any situation where there's a crisis, it's also important to realize that that crisis is probably on the leader, and it's their fault. And the biggest kind of solution that they talk about time and time again is just making sure that like the mission and objectives are super, super clear. And I think one way you might be able to prevent that is when you're talking about missions and objectives, do that in person at an offsite and over the course of a few days and just repeat it until everyone is really crystal clear on it. I also think distributed is a fancy way of saying we have a really special way of welcoming people onto our team and are probably really quick to remove people that aren't a fit. And if you're working in a more traditional construction, that's just sort of self-evident. When a new person joins, they start showing up. And so you can kind of be lazy about how you welcome people. I don't think you can on distributed teams. You have to like think of it almost as a product. How do you welcome a new person on board? When are they going to come to the next offsite? How do you kind of bring them in and teach them the culture? And I think that can help at least prevent some of the crises. And then when there is a crisis, you just have to move on fast.
Thank you.
Hi, Dustin, thanks. Great talk. I'm starting a company I've been starting it for like 10 years on autonomous vehicles and transportation with that. The problem is that it's really focused, but right now there is so much noise around that I think it's probably an obstacle more than, my team has like 20 years expertise in this, but I think right now that there's so much noise that it's like hampering us rather than helping us. Well, what would you suggest for presenting this to investors?
That's a great question, and I I agree with you. It's it's hype run amok, and there's so much hype that it turns into noise. I think the best thing you can do in those situations is first of all make sure you're working with and talking to people who are actual specialists in that area. I think part of the challenge with autonomy especially is, there's people who know very little about the enabling technologies now kind of acting as experts, and that's what creates this dissonance where in most cases what you'll find is those people are waiting for an expert to move. And so for you, I think you just have to ignore that class of people and do the best you can to work with and get advice from and take feedback from experts in the space. And my guess is maybe you've done that already and they've had some sort of feedback. To my earlier point, I think internalize that feedback in a very kind of self-aware way. And at this point, if the market has like gone through and done its work on all the autonomy startups and there's nothing there, I don't know what that means in your case in particular, but have a hard discussion about it. The last piece I would say is I'm actually not super knowledgeable about this space, but it seems as if from our portfolio, the people who are most excited about it are very concentrated geographically, even though I have noticed that there are a lot of very talented computer vision kind of specialists from France, but there's just a premium on being being near other people in that space. So sadly, I'm not one to suggest that teams move, but if you're not finding the real actual specialists and not getting the feedback that you want, I think you kind of have to go to them and wherever that might be, and then do kind of the distributed thing that we've been talking about, where the founder builds the network where that capital is, and then distributes the team according to where the talent is.
Thanks a lot. One last question. We have time for one last question if you have it. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for all your feedbacks. Do you see any kind of difference between French and American investors and French and American startuppers, for example? Can you see that here, or in a more general way?
I don't know this group very well, but I met the family for the first time, I think it was like 6 years ago, back when it was in a small apartment and just getting started. And so I've kind of tracked the family and generally kind of French entrepreneurs. I think, apologies, we're going to play in the world of generalizations, which I generally try not to do, but I think what I'm going to say is a compliment to French people generally. Americans, I think, Americans are kind of, I think, seen and probably accurately as these sort of like just crazy aggressive kind of cowboy types who just run and go, and to a point of negativity. And I think inside the American startup scene right now, we're definitely having a discussion. I don't know if he coined it, but Alexis Ohanian calls it hustle porn, and it's basically this idea that you work yourself to near death, just like trying to achieve something. It's very American in its beauty and its flaws. But when I look at the biggest successes from the French ecosystem, and it's something I love about French people, it seems as if there's like a humanity and a sense of humanity around both the approach to the product and how the product is positioned in the users' lives. And I think France generally and French entrepreneurs should take that and continue to build on that. It's when people say product, I think it's almost an abstraction of the word empathy. And when I walk around Paris and I see people in the city and even the sidewalk culture, there's like such a love of conversation and even the way they look at each other and gestate with their hands and talk. There's just a high level of empathy. And the best products that anyone has ever built, frankly, just have a high level of empathy for their users. And if there's a way for French entrepreneurs to bottle that up and scale it, I think regardless of any of the challenges that the ecosystem has, ultimately it will succeed because the best products tend to win. So yeah, I would hold on to that and then maybe take what you can from, in a lot of cases, it's not even American entrepreneurs, it's the entrepreneurs America imports, and they just move very quickly. Again, however you do that personally, if you can combine the French empathy with the sustainable but nonetheless sustained hustle, that's a really, really powerful combination. And I think when I look at the French companies that have succeeded, they exhibit that in spades, whether it's Front or some of the others where I don't know them super well, but just kind of having observed them. And then when I've tried their products, I'm like, wow, they like really understand the user's challenges in a way that a lot of other companies didn't. And in a lot of cases, they're in commodity spaces, right? They're working with email or something that's kind of something we don't love in life and annoys us, but they've built an incredible business around making that part of communication so much better.
Thank you.
Dustin, thanks a lot. Thanks again so much for coming here and answering everybody's questions. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Que l'enfant